are pretty when Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight I'm here with another wine-infused Sunday evening book tag. This one is thanks to Eric Carl Anderson. This is his Future Classics book tag, which he originated last week or just a few days ago, and I'm going to take a stab at it myself. I've really debated whether this was a tag that was meant for me because I have a perhaps idiosyncratic, problematic, somewhat cantankerous relationship to the whole notion of literary classic. So I'm going to start with that. Then I'll go get to Eric's questions. I have trouble relating to the idea of literary classics. So I did some kind of research online, and I found an excerpt from Italo Calvino's book-length essay, Why Read the Classics? And there are 14 reasons. They're short, so I'm going to go through them one by one and hopefully thread some of those through my answers to the questions. And I'll talk a little bit about them as I go through. So, why read the classics, according to Calvino? Number 1. The classics are those books about which you usually hear people say, I'm rereading, never, I'm reading. That, to me, says nobody wants to admit to be reading it for the first time, unless perhaps they're quite young. But everybody wants us to know they're rereading them. So there's a little bit of status there. There may be other nuances, but that's what I get from it. Number 2. He says, the classics are those books which constitute a treasured experience for those who have read and loved them, but they remain just as rich in experience for those who reserve the chance to read them for when they are in the best condition to enjoy them. This one is, I think it's a bit of a mess of an argument, but there's 2 points. A classic is a book that people treasure and love. They read them, they love them. And then the second one, I'm not sure it really is connected deeply to the first, that a classic is something that you put off until you think you're ready to read it. So I don't know if those two go together or not, but fair enough. Number 3, the classics are books which exercise a particular influence, both when they imprint themselves on our imagination as unforgettable, and when they hide in the layers of memory disguised as the individual's or the collective unconscious. I don't want to get into too much psychoanalytic gobbledygook, but that is really interesting. So the classic is something that either collectively, I don't know, collective unconscious, blah, 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 but collectively or on the individual level, which is how I relate to this point, really get inside us and leave a lasting impression. So yeah, fair enough. 4, a classic is a book which, with each rereading, offers as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. Yes. I have read Mrs. Dalloway several times, and each time I get something new, and that's both autobiographically, that makes sense autobiographically. The older I get, there's different things that it says to me, but also it's such a rich, dense text. Right? I agree with that. Number 5. A classic is a book which, even when we read it for the first time, gives the sense of rereading something we have read before. So, something universal that it just kind of evokes some of the truths that literature has offered up in past classics or past amazing reading experiences. Okay. 6, a classic is a book which has never exhausted all it has to say to its readers. Well, I sure love that kind of a book. I'm going to take issue with applying the word classic to several of these points at the end, but fair enough. I love that. 7, the classics are those books which come to us bearing the aura of previous interpretations, and trailing behind them the traces they have left in the culture or cultures, or just in the languages and customs, through which they have passed. So this is a really kind of academic thing, like this is for people who've been educated in the humanities, and there's a lot of critical response to text down through the centuries. That one leaves me cold. But for people that care about academia, that probably has some resonance. Point number 8 has an adjective that Italo Calvino has coined, and if you Google this word, every reference is to either his use of it in this book or in If on Winter's Night a Traveler. He made this word up. It denotes fine powder, like pulverize, but the word doesn't exist except in 2 of his books. Pulviscular, okay? 8. A classic is a work which constantly generates a pulviscular cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off. Aside from that ridiculous word, I love this point. Critical discourse could be something as plebeian as a booktube review by me or someone, or a professional book review, or academic literary criticism, but it generates a lot of attention, but it's always shaking it off. I love that image. Love it! 9. Classics are books which, the more we think we know them through hearsay, the more original, unexpected, and innovative we find them when we actually read them. One of the books I'll talk about, my experience really resonates with this point, so yeah, I love that. 10. A classic is the term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe, a book on a par with ancient talismans. I reject that one completely out of hand. That is crap. 11. Maybe my favorite of the list. Your classic is a book to which you cannot remain indifferent, and which helps you define yourself in relation or even in opposition to it. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. This idea of a classic I get and want to promulgate. 12. A classic is a work which comes before other classics, but those who have read other classics first immediately recognize its place in the genealogy of classic works. I think that's probably true. That's, again, very academic and historical. I don't care about that, but I don't have much to take issue with about it either. 13. A classic is a work which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, which, at the same time, the classics cannot exist without. That is fantastic. That is such a rich, reverberating idea of what a classic is, and it's totally paired with number 14. So now, listen to this. Number 14. A classic is a work which persists as a background noise even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway. So those two together, bear repeating. 13. A classic is a work which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, which at the same time the classics cannot exist without. 14. A classic is a work which persists as a background noise even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway. That tension between something that is timeless, I don't like the word universal, but I'll say it in quotes, universal, and with whatever's going on in the present. And the flip of that really speaks to me. Okay, so the ones that I like, I am able to think about, talk about, and recognize in my reading without so much as using the word classic. To me, classic could be any book that I love that fits some of these points. But we'll go with it. I don't want to over-problematize, but this was a fascinating list. Please give me your thoughts on it. But I would say I would throw almost all of them out the window and just use Mark Twain's definition. He said, a classic is something that everybody wants to have read and nobody wants to read. Here. And that's one of my big problems with the idea of a classic, a literary classic. Books that are in the canon, books that we're forced to read, most of us hate because we're forced to read them. So that is the part of canonicity and the idea of a classic that I really struggle with. So Mark Twain, yes, I agree. That's what a classic is. I also really loved Jennifer of Insert Literary Pun Here's video called, I didn't make a note, but I believe it's called Reading the Classics. I'll put a link in the show notes. And she says, I'm going to just mention a couple points she made. The first one is a direct quote. She said, if a classic can't speak to people on a basic human level, then it doesn't deserve the title. I agree. She talks about how there's a lot of people who read classics, they don't get it, they're confused, they feel stupid, and she is rejecting that and arguing that we readers, especially who are classically, literarily, academically trained readers, should be more forthcoming about the classics we hate, the parts of classics that we don't like, what we find boring, what does really get us going and excites us, to dispel this sense of inferiority that some readers feel when they try to tackle a classic, and I loved that approach. Please check out the video. She says it shouldn't be a gated community. Amen. And just a couple more quick points before I move on to the questions. I remember, I think it was when Michael Jackson died, that there was a lot of musicologists or music reviewers or music critics who said, and I may have the artist wrong, maybe it wasn't Michael Jackson, but that's what I think so, that he was the last pop star or the last musician that everybody listened to. And starting around 1990s or whatever, the culture just atomized, just split into this little group of people who like this kind of music and so on, and nobody was listening to the same music ever after. And I think that has already started to happen in literature, don't you? So that's why I'm in a way, I'm kind of going through the motions with this tag, because I don't believe that there's going to be a book that any of us are all going to be reading in the future. I don't think that's true now. You can talk about the people who like the literary prizes. I'm one. Peg, Eric, many of us. But how many millions are reading genre fiction of one kind or another, or fantasy, or this or that? I think those days are over, but what is a classic? A classic is what's taught at university. It's the canon. There has been for decades controversy about, should we just get rid of the canon, or should we just open it up? And I don't live that debate. As you know, I'm a very subjective reader, and I read whatever I goddamn well please. And so I love stumbling on classics that I end up enjoying. But I love finding books from other cultures translated, or from Africa, or indigenous Canadian fiction, or you name it. So do I want those to go into the canon? I don't really care about the canon. I just want to find stories that resonate and electrify me. So again, going back to Calvino's book, to which I cannot remain indifferent. Okay, so all that in the background, I'm going to now go to Eric's questions and hopefully go through them fairly quickly, so this doesn't end up being too long of a video. But I did want to kind of set the background so that I could give authentic answers to his questions. Okay? His first question is, pick an established classic that you think will still be relevant in the future. Last year I read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I had put off reading that book for decades because I just thought it was going to be a musty old classic, and I was intimidated by the African-American diction on the page that I thought would be hard to read. And by about page 3, I realized this was no musty old classic. This was an alive novel that just danced off the page and into my imagination, and I absolutely loved it. It's my favorite American novel, and the prose just sings. The African-American diction took me about 2 pages to get used to it, no problem. So I believe, just based on my feelings, this one kind of resonates with Calvino's point number 2, that it was a treasured experience. I read it, I loved it, and I had to wait until it was the right time to read it, and then it really spoke deeply to me. So that's all I can say. I can't say that other readers in the future will care about it. I loved it. I would also add all of the novels by Virginia Woolf, even though I haven't read all of them, but I think I've read maybe 3/5 of them. And reread Mrs. Dalloway for the 3rd time last year. And again, rereading offers as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. That's Calvino's point number 4. So that, classic, yes. Let's keep Virginia. Number 2, pick a recent book which you feel has gone under the radar, but which you're confident will be a future classic. So again, with all of my misgivings about the word classic, I'm going to very briefly talk about 2. And funnily enough, they're both, one is from India and the other is a writer of Indian background. They're both published last year. Gachar Gochar by Vivek Shambag, a short little novel about a Bangalore family that rode the economic boom that raised so many people up economically in India, and the complicated family dynamics, very spare prose and understated, and when you get to the end you realize just all the darkness lurking beneath this rather ordinary family story, and such small moments rendered so vividly that I'll never forget them. There's a woman that brings some homemade curry to a man, and it ends up falling on the ground outside the house, and I will never forget that scene as long as I live. I believe people will still be reading, enthusing over Gachar Gochar in a half century. I hope so. And the other one is White Tears by Harry Kunzru. And Harry Kunzru is an Indo-British novelist who now lives in America, but he had lived in America less than a decade when he wrote this, the most incisive, important American novel I've ever read, about a couple of young white guys that are remixing African-American blues music, and it gets all Murakami-esque and slipstreamy, and the politics of music and the politics of race threaded through that story in a way that just blew me away. And this one makes me think about, I don't really like to talk about the fact that I've read it, but I would like to soon be saying that I'm rereading it because there was so much to take in that it just rendered me inarticulate. I've said that about 1,000 times on this channel, and I just think it's going to speak to people about America and race on into the future. So those two. Number 3, pick a title that won one of your favorite book prizes recently, which you think will still be lauded in 50 years' time. I believe this one won the Governor General's Award in 2016, but I'm not entirely sure. But it's Madeleine Tien's 2016 novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing. This is the best novel I've ever read, and it's about a group of relatives and friends in China during the second half of the 20th century, which was a very challenging time to be Chinese. And they are all composers and musicians. And so they lived through the Communist Revolution, and then especially the Cultural Revolution, and on up to and past Tiananmen Square. And I didn't want to read it because I didn't think I was particularly interested in modern Chinese history or classical music. And this book just seized hold of me and wouldn't let go. So I hope that people will still be reading and discussing this book. Number 4, pick a recent book you haven't read yet, but which you think might become a classic based on reputation alone. For example, reviews, GoodReads reviews, booktube recommendation. This is the one I struggled with the most because I don't really think that way until I've read it. In this fantasy world, I'm the creator of the canon, right? If I'm answering the questions, I'm creating the canon. So if I haven't read it, the question doesn't mean very much to me. But so I'm going to cheat a little bit, because one recent book that's getting a lot of buzz, it's deeper than buzz. Several readers that I really trust and you often agree with, or at least sometimes agree with, have given really thoughtful appreciations of this novel. And it just came out, I believe, middle of January. In the last 3 weeks it came out. And I started reading it today, so I'm only a few pages in. And that is Fire Sermon by Jamie Quattro. So because of my response to the first 10 or 15 pages, I'm going to say I think this one could become a classic. And I'll tell you why. It's about a love affair that a seemingly happy married woman has with one of her best friends after more than 20 years of marriage. And that could be so banal. And there's a lot, they're both devout Christians, and I'm kind of allergic to those kind of stories. These people, booktubers and whatnot, GoodReads friends, Litzy friends, said, oh my god, it's so amazing, it's powerful. And then I started reading it, and by about page 5, it went back to the woman's original marriage 23 years prior, and I could see that it was going to be an extended scene about marriage. God, I don't know if am I going to bail before this scene is through? I don't want to read about a wedding. And it was the most non-cliched, beautifully bonkers description of a wedding that I think I've ever read. It's certainly my favorite wedding scene that I can ever remember reading. And I thought, okay, there's something special going on here. So that's all I have to go on. That's my answer for this question. Maybe Fire Sermon. Question 5. Pick a favorite book that you want to save for your grandchildren. Ain't gonna be having any of those, just like Eric. Or your friends' grandchildren to read in 50 years' time. I don't think I'm going to be around in 50 years' time, but you never know. Still be making booktube videos at the age of 102. Hello, I'm Sean the Bookman. So I picked one for younger children and one for adults, the one for younger children. And again, this is a classic that I put off reading for years because of my prejudice towards the classics. And that is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I read it about a year and a half ago, and it is a thing of wonder, a joyous beautiful story that we all should read at least once a year, no matter our age. That one. And my second favorite novel of all time, Anthony Marra's A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, which is one of the most powerful novels I've ever read about surviving through wartime, and the writing just blew me away. I'm not going to try to talk about it here because the video's gone on long enough, but those two I would put in a little time capsule. So those are my answers. I would be delighted to hear any comments you have on Calvino's or Twain's comments, Jennifer's comments, or my choices below. And in the meantime, I'm going to tag a few people. I don't think any of these were tagged by Eric. Juliet Ann, Jan at Remembered Reads, Jess at Garden Scriptorium, Adam at Memento Mori, Diana at Diana in Color, Chris at Chris Bookish Cauldron, Leah at Hide and Seek, and Doris at Aldi Books. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.